Hello students, today we will continue to discuss about another mainstream theory that is called classical liberal international theory. There are two mainstream theories in international relations. One we discussed, that is the realist theory, and this is the second theory, and these two theories are called the mainstream theories in international relations. And in fact the growth of these two theories was made on the basis of the criticism towards each other, and those criticisms from each other actually helped to refine those theories. And there were so many reformulations also in the main tenets of these theories. So we will proceed like this. First we will talk about the background of liberal international theory, then we will be talking about the early influences, then we will discuss about the liberal idealism. So let us first discuss about the background of classical international relations theory. The liberal international theory is the other mainstream theory which is based on the premises of classical liberal philosophy. You must have read about the classical liberal philosophy in the third paper in your graduation program, and you must have read about the classical political philosophers like John Locke, Rousseau. Then you must have read about John Stuart Mill, Bentham, T.H. Green, so many political philosophers, those who actually contributed to a large extent for the liberal political philosophy. There are in fact 6 key concepts of classical liberal philosophy that are commonly mentioned by the liberal writers. So if you look at those philosophies, those philosophical thinkers, you will find that they are talking about 6 important values of the classical liberal philosophy. They are individualism, that is the individual is the main object of study or main object of investigation. Then second is freedom, the protection of large private sphere for the individual. You can recall the arguments of John Stuart Mill, who was talking about the self regarding areas and the others regarding areas. The self regarding was related to your private sphere, and the other regarding areas were those that affected the others. So he made that clear distinction, and in those personal sphere or in your self regarding sphere you are free to do whatever you like, but in the other regarding sphere you have to think about others, because how you enjoy your rights, if it affects the others, then there may be some restriction by the government or the state. Then the third important value was natural law. Basically when we say natural law, we consider that before the formation of the state and the establishment of the government, there were certain rights that were prevalent, and those rights are called the natural rights. So it was there before the establishment of the state and formation of the government. So that's why they are called natural. Then the another value is your spontaneous order based on the evolution of social practices like free market economy. So there are certain values like market economy that has evolved over a period of time. Democracy, market economy, and so many other values, nobody has thought about it, but they evolved over a period of time, and that's why we consider that those values are the most important values. And then we talk about the rule of law, that is basically enforced by the state. If the state is not implementing any law or protecting the violation of the law, that may create anarchy, that may create disorder in the society, and that's why it is the responsibility of the state to give protection to those who follow the laws and punish those who violate the laws. And last is your limited state. Basically the liberal political philosophers, they talk about limited state, and a state can be limited if there is a written constitution, if everything is demarcated in the constitution, if there is a separation of power that will control the dictatorial tendencies of the government. So a written constitution and proper division of power between different organs of the government will actually make the state limited or the government limited. So although there are differences between the state and the government, because government represents the state and government is temporary and the state is permanent, but the government has to be limited, also the state has to be limited, because that otherwise they will create problems for individual rights. The different classifications of classical liberalism is based on different interpretation of these 6 core elements. So, if there are any varieties of liberalism, so those varieties are based on different interpretation of these core values that we have to understand. The liberal international theory, or in shortcut you can say LIT, developed after the Second World War and is divided into 2 parts. One is called the classical liberal theory, the other is called the neoliberal theory. So, basically the kind of theory we are talking about that developed after the Second World War, and in the 1960s and 70s there were so many issues with the classical liberalism, and that is why there was another variety of classical liberalism and or classical liberal theory that we call as neoliberalism. It is related to but distinct from the utopianism of the interwar period. So, when the First World War ended and the Second World War began, so in this 20 years there was a liberal philosophy or liberalism that many consider as utopianism or that consider as idealism, because whatever ideas was given during the interwar period, there was liberalism that was considered as utopian or idealistic, because whatever they said about in international order or international politics, that was considered something out of the ground reality, and that is why this classical liberal theory is inspired by it and also by the traditional liberal political philosophers or classical political philosophers, but it is distinct from this kind of utopianism and idealism, because the kind of international liberal theory we are talking about that developed particularly after the Second World War on the basis of the political, social and economic developments that led to Second World War, and because of the collapse of the League of Nations and the outbreak of Second World War, there were a lot of changes in the world. Those changes were studied by the classical liberal theory, and on that basis there were changes in the idealistic liberal theory, or what he called liberal internationalism. The liberal international theory focuses on the individual as the unit of analysis and has a distinctive view of the relationship between the macro and micro level in international relations. If you look at the classical liberal international theory, you will find that they base their argument starting with the individual, and we have already discussed that there are 4 levels of analysis in international relations. So, they are individual level, they are domestic level, they are regional level, they are systemic level. So, we have already discussed that in the level of analysis in international relations, and if you look at the classical liberal international relations theory, they start with their argument with the individual at the center, individual at the main focus, and in fact they make no distinction between the domestic and the international. They combine in fact the micro and macro aspects of international arena. So, that is how they are different from in a major way they are different from the realist theory. This has led to different view that the state-centric mentality of realism and brought forward the idea of pluralism in the actors of international relations besides the nation state. So, this is the point on the basis of which you can find a kind of major difference between the classical liberal international theory and realism, because for realism particularly for the new realism you will find that they give importance to systemic factors only. So, if you look at the classical realism and the other variants of realism, you will find that they are talking of the domestic and international, but for classical liberal international theory there is no distinction between the domestic and the international. In fact, international is influenced by what is happening at the domestic level, and the domestic level is also influenced by what is happening in the international level, and with the core focus on the individual. So, that is how the classical international relations theory, particularly the liberal classical international theory, that is talking of plurality of actors starting with the individual. Then there are state actors, there are non-state actors, there are supranational actors, there are transnational actors. So, all these make international politics an area or an arena where you will find multi-actor kind of system, not a state-centric actor only. So, that is how the classical liberal international theory is considered different from the realist tradition. Now let us focus on the early influences. The roots of classical liberalism can be traced back to ancient thinkers, but it was developed as a political theory only in the 17th century by writers like John Locke, whose philosophical and theological defense of individual freedom, religious toleration and state's limited role inspired other liberal thinkers. So, if you remember about John Locke's political philosophy, particularly he is talking of the individual freedom, how the individuals enjoyed their freedom, their rights in the state of nature. He was talking of three important kinds of rights: right to life, liberty and property, and they were enjoying those rights even before the formation of the state. And because they are rational human beings, they are rational actors, so they respected others' rights, because they realized that if they violate others' rights, that will also create problem for them to enjoy their own rights. So in order to better enjoy their freedoms, their rights, they established the state, and they also established the government, and the government should be limited one, and the government and the state they were supposed to protect those rights, and they were also supposed not to violate those rights. And in case the government violates those rights, the citizens, the people had the right to revolt against the government, and that may lead to the change of the government. So the formation of the government was conditional for protecting the natural rights of the people. So that was his philosophy. So next is your Immanuel Kant, an 18th century German philosopher, who thought that international anarchy can be overcome through a particular kind of collective action, basically a federation of republics in which sovereignties would be left intact, which could eventually establish perpetual peace in the world. So Kant was talking of perpetual peace, and this perpetual peace in the international system could be established if there is a federation of republics in which many countries would be there, and they would be left intact, basically to establish a kind of international confederation, or you can say international federation with one international organization that could ensure perpetual peace in the world. So that was the reason why he talked about perpetual peace, and this idea of Immanuel Kant actually influenced a whole lot of liberal thinkers to focus on democracy and the good effects of democracy, and how democracy actually contributes for less violence, less authoritarianism, and less problems in the world. And that is how many US presidents, they particularly made it as a foreign policy choice for them, because they realized and they were inspired by this thinking of Immanuel Kant, that if there is more democracy in the world, that there would be less violence, less war, less problem. So in that way, Immanuel Kant was one of the great influencers, or was one of the great influential figure in the history of liberal philosophy. Then Hugo Grotius, a Dutch jurist, who defined natural law as the basis of international law, and argued that states in the international anarchy are constrained by rules of law and by the interest in preserving the international society. So Hugo Grotius particularly gave importance to the natural law, because that was considered as something or some cornerstone of international law, and he argued that you can contain international anarchy only by the restoration of rule of law and by the interest in preserving the international society. So every state has a moral obligation to preserve the international society, because that will serve their long-term interest. So that is how Hugo Grotius became a influential figure in the development of liberal political philosophy. Then Jeremy Bentham, who was a British political philosopher, he advocated and believed in the power of law to solve the problem of war. He believed in attaining the greatest good for the greatest number are the principal criteria of utilitarian thought. So basically you identify the utilitarian philosophy in political science with Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, and Bentham particularly argued that he particularly gave the term called international or interstate relations, what we discussed, and he is talking of the greatest happiness of the greatest number. In that way, he is also different from Gandhi, who is talking of Sarvodaya. So Bentham is talking of majority and Gandhi is talking of all. But in any way, Bentham argued that states in international anarchy, the anarchical tendencies, their violent behavior can be contained by following the rule of law, and they have an interest in preserving the international society. And how that if the law is obeyed by all the states, irrespective of their size, irrespective of their power position, how that will help to maintain the international order. That was the main argument of Jeremy Bentham. In the 19th century, liberalism was reformulated by adding a preference for democracy over aristocracy and for free trade over national economic self-sufficiency. So if you look at the 19th century liberalism, you will find that basically all the philosophers, they were talking of the virtues of democracy and how free market economy will contribute for attainment of individual rights and individual economic freedom, and how that would be beneficial for all the states if they become democratic countries. In this context, Richard Cobden, for example, believed that free trade would create a more peaceful world order and bring mutual gains to all the states, irrespective of the size or nature of their economies. So it was Cobden who strongly advocated for free trade, because if there is more and more free trade, that will lead to more peaceful world, because free trade will be beneficial for all the countries for mutual gain. So if they focus on mutual gain, they will not engage in war. So that was his argument. Then the about liberal idealism, that was a prominent kind of ideology, kind of philosophy in the interwar period. The initial utopian phase of the study of world politics, known as idealism, also known as liberal internationalism, was developed during an era when many believed that the reform of international politics was not only essential but also clearly achievable. So after the First World War, there were liberal thinkers who thought that there is a need to reform international politics, which is not just needed, rather it is a necessary condition, because in that way we can ensure peace and security in the world. Whether or not the global order can be radically improved has been a central question in the study of international relations ever since. So how to reform the global order, how to carefully craft a global order. So that has been the central question of all the theories, either it is realism or it is liberalism, but every theory was concerned about this major issue. Its greatest adherent was US President Woodrow Wilson, who authored the Covenant of the League of Nations, hence the term Wilsonian idealism. So basically it was due to the ideas, due to the efforts of the American President Woodrow Wilson, the League of Nations was established. In a major way he contributed for the liberal idealism of the interwar period. Two major points in Wilson's ideas for a more peaceful world deserve special emphasis. The first concerns is promotion of democracy and self-determination. So basically it was Woodrow Wilson's belief that if there is more and more democracy in the world, there will be less violence, there less conflict, less problem, and he also supported the idea of self-determination for the people living in colonies, living in the colonial world. So that was his first major contribution. The second was the creation of an international organization that would put relations between states on a solid institutional foundation. Wilson believed that if there is an international organization that would take care of all the states, or it would provide a platform for the states to mutually solve their problem. So, and that resulted in the establishment of the League of Nations and also the International Court of Justice. So in this way, Wilson's ideas and Wilson's efforts led to the establishment of the League of Nations and International Court of Justice. Norman Angell is another prominent liberal idealist of the same era. In 1909, he published his book entitled as The Great Illusion and argued that in modern times, territorial conquest is extremely expensive and politically divisive because it severely disrupts international commerce. So it was Angel's argument that if you think of territorial conquest or imperialism and colonialism, and or if you fight over the colonies, that will definitely lead to the disruption of international trade and commerce, and so he discouraged the idea of imperialism and colonialism in the interest of economic freedom, in the interest of global trade and commerce. Just I can cite one example to just make this point clear. India has recently declared that it is going to establish the India Middle East European Economic Corridor, but due to the outbreak of the war between Hamas and Israel, the whole idea of this corridor in the paper. So that shows that if there is a war, if there is a problem, that will not help for better economic exchange, better international trade and commerce. So that is how the ideas of Angel is more important. For the interwar years, during the normative phase of the growth of the discipline, it was marked by a commitment to global institutional reform and change. So the interwar liberals, they particularly focus on reforming the international system by establishing global institutions like the League of Nations. The idealists maintained that war was partially the result of international anarchy and also partially as a result of misunderstanding, miscalculation and recklessness on the part of the politicians who had lost control of events in 1914. So differing from the realist, the idealist thinkers or the idealist liberal thinkers, they were arguing that it is not that anarchy is everything to understand, or anarchy would actually help you to understand everything. The idealist liberal thinkers, they argued that if there was First World War, it was not just because of anarchy, but it was also partly the misunderstandings, the miscalculations and the recklessness of on the part of the politicians, those who lost control of events till 1914, and because in 1914 there was First World War. So the point is, these kind of it's not a result of only one side or the presence of anarchy, rather the other side has to be looked into, and that is the role of the individual political leaders, those who were reckless, those who were non-serious, those who misunderstood the things and also miscalculated, that ultimately resulted in the First World War. They argued that a more peaceful world order would be created by making foreign policy elites accountable to the public opinion and by democratizing international relations. So naturally, if you think of a peaceful world order, so this peaceful world order would be possible if you make your political leaders accountable to the domestic public opinion, and also by democratizing international relations through the establishment of international organizations. The distinctive characteristics of these scholars were their belief in progress, especially that the system of international relations that had given rise to the First World War was capable of being transformed into a fundamentally more peaceful and just world order. So, basically the idealists, they were the people who believed in the progress, those who believed in the better qualities of human being, and that's why they thought that if we really want the international relations to improve or international relations to be better, then we can change it, transform it by fundamentally making major reforms in it, and that would actually lead to a more peaceful and just world order. Thus, under the impact of the awakening of democracy, the growth of international mind, the development of League of Nations, the good works of the men of peace, the nature of global politics can be transformed. So that was their strong belief that if there is more and more democracy in the world, if there is the growth of international mind, particularly if there are more people who are inclined for internationalism, those who think about the international order. So, and if there is a international organization like League of Nations, and if there are peaceful men, those who are in power in different states, in different countries, then the nature of global politics can be changed, can be transformed. So all these conditions, they are necessary for preventing another war and for establishing better kind of international peace and security in the world. These ideas had some success in the 1920s, because there was League of Nations which was established, and the great powers took some further steps to assure each other of their peaceful intentions. So, whatever the arguments were made by these idealist political thinkers, so that ultimately led to the establishment of the League of Nations and the International Court of Justice, and in this way we can find some success of liberal thinkers. They however suffered hard blows with the growth of the fascist and Nazi dictatorship in Italy, Germany and Spain. Authoritarianism also increased in many new states of Central and Eastern Europe. Problem with the idealist thinkers was that they have not understood the real politics in the world, in the interstate relationship, and that is how because of the socio-political and economic conditions of those 20 years, those interwar period, there was fascist and Nazi dictatorship in Italy, Germany, in Spain, and also there were more authoritarianism and kind of military dictatorship in many of the new states of Central and Eastern Europe. So in a way it speaks about the failure of the liberal international thinkers of the interwar period. Let us summarize what we have discussed so far. We discussed that liberal international relations theory has adapted itself as per the challenges of the post-World War II period on the one hand and the realist critique on the other hand. It is divided into two parts. First, the classical liberal theory, and secondly, the neoliberal theory. The liberal international relations theory focuses on individual as the unit of analysis and has a distinctive view of the relationship between macro and micro in international arena. Early influences of classical liberal philosophy on liberal international relations theory include the writings of John Locke, Immanuel Kant, Hugo Grotius, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill and Richard Cobden. The early utopian liberal theory believed that the reform of international politics was not only essential but clearly achievable. The idealists believed that under the impact of awakening of democracy, growth of international mind and good works of men of peace, the nature of global politics can be transformed. Liberal idealism, however, suffered hard blows with the fascist and Nazi dictatorship in Italy, Germany and Spain, and also in many other countries such as Japan. We will continue our discussion on classical liberal international relations theory in the next lecture. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you once again.